watching Roll Tide Daily, the new daily program for Crimson Tide fans, presented by SEC Country. Now, here's your host, former Alabama All-American, Mike Johnson.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back into this special Monday edition of Roll Tide Daily. Apologize for being a little bit late on air. We're trying to get caught up on a couple things behind the scenes today, but we're going to bring you 30 minutes, obviously, of some very special video presentation. Your favorite 30 minutes of your day, the favorite 30 minutes of my day as well. Appreciate you guys sticking with us. We got a lot of stuff to cover as we kind of dive into a bunch of the topics today. We're going to talk a little bit of non-conference schedule, schedules of weakness. This is peak June talk, really, in a lot of the college football world. But we're also going to dive back into some of the offensive line experience, not only at Alabama, but for some of Alabama's biggest opponents. When you talk about Auburn, when you talk about LSU, talk about games started, games plays. We're going to take the talent portion out of this and talk about what experience really means for some of these offensive line groups around the country. We also have a legendary coach, Bobby Bowden, that took to the airwaves over the weekend over in Birmingham, WBRC, I believe it was, caught up with him at the golf course, asked him about Jalen versus Tua. So we're going to dive into that a little bit later and talk about really what's been one of the biggest offseason storylines as far as Alabama football goes in quite some time. Without further ado, though, before we get rolling on this thing, I want to talk about the question of the day and bring that to you. Let me ask you something for the question of the day here, and I think this is a hot topic for a lot of people. We've heard Finebaum weigh in it. We've heard Chris Lowe write columns about it. ESPN's been weighing in on a ton. Should you be embarrassed about Bama's non-conference schedule? Does it concern you as a Bama fan? That's the question of the day. Does it concern you as a Bama fan who Bama is playing for their non-conference opponents? Obviously, we're going to go over it a little bit, as we're going to get into it here as we roll down the show. But I'd like to see some of you guys begin to weigh in the comment section as we turn to get towards that kind of topic of the day. So without further ado, I want to be sure and put up this non-conference schedule as we start to lead off this topic. Chris Lowe did a great job for ESPN.com kind of highlighting some of the weakest non-conference schedules throughout the Power 5. And I think we have the graphic to show you guys of what Bama's actual non-conference schedule it is. There you have it, September 1st versus Louisville. If we go back to that previous slide, September 1st versus Louisville down in Orlando, Florida. That's the one we're counting down to. What is it? Like 79, 78, 77, 76 days away until Bama kicks off against their opponents down in Louisville. There you see in week 2, they get Arkansas State. Later on in September, lining up against Louisiana Lafayette. And November 17th, the week before the Iron Bowl, you guys know that the pre-made cupcake on the schedule that'll be showing up there in Tuscaloosa, that'll be the Citadel. Now, I do want to highlight what Chris Lowe had to say about some of these non-conference opponents. If we could show you guys that up on the screen. He had some interesting comments talking about Alabama's out-of-conference opponents being among the weakest. He ranked them as 10th in the nation in terms of weakest non-conference opponents. The headliner for Alabama is Louisville and Orlando, but the Cardinals lose one of the most dangerous players in college football game and quarterback Lamar Jackson and return only 2 starters on defense. Chris Lowe would go on to say in his next portion of the comments as far as that goes. Now, remember, Lamar Jackson was a Heisman Trophy winner, so Chris Lowe obviously kind of bringing light on that subject. But here he goes on to say, Nick Saban hasn't lost a non-conference game in the regular season since his first year at Alabama in 2007 when the Tide lost to Louisiana Monroe. I happened to be on the field for that one, so thank you, Chris Lowe, for pointing that out. Hard to see that changing with this schedule. Now, there's a ton of things to break down in terms of Bama's non-conference schedule. First of all, the question of the day, going back to it, is, are you concerned about it? As an Alabama fan, is this one of the things you kind of cringe when you see? Is it one of those things that's, hey, take it or leave it, kind of is what it is? Or do you say, no, it's just another W on the schedule in terms of what we want to see coming down the schedule? I think mostly it's the season ticket holders that really have the gripe in terms of, whether or not you want to see an Arkansas State or one of these other programs coming in making $1 million to play Alabama in Bryant-Denny Stadium. For a lot of people, they say, hey, listen, that's kind of an honor in and of itself. There's a few different ways in breaking this down. First of all, you want to talk about what the non-conference schedules from around the country are going to be, right? I told you this is the 10th ranked non-conference schedule. There's a couple of other SEC teams that are being thrown into the mix. But, I mean, really, when you look around at the schedule, you have to take it as a whole, right? You have to take the SEC West. You have to understand that Ole Miss is pretty good. They're going to face off against LSU. You're going to face off against Auburn. You're going to face off against a good Mississippi State team. You're going to face off against a growing Texas A&M team. So when you talk about these schedules, I don't want to just highlight the non-conference schedule. I want to make sure we take that as a whole and kind of soak that in as Bama fans. So, I mean, last year when you played FSU, nobody wanted to talk about FSU. This year when you're playing Louisville, which a game which you scheduled 4 years ago, everybody wants to point to the fact that Lamar Jackson's leaving. Listen, when you schedule this game, Lamar Jackson wasn't even playing, much less had won a Heisman Trophy. So I think it's kind of it's one of those things when you look at the national media kind of highlighting. Now, I think it is interesting in and of myself to highlight the fact that, hey, listen, I do want to see Bama play tough for opponents. I think I'm kind of in the minority when it comes to a lot of these things. I don't want to say I'm embarrassed in terms of the way I see Alabama's schedule playing out. Listen, Bama's playing Citadel before the Iron Bowl. Auburn's going to play Liberty University, who's just now making the jump up to Division I. So, it's kind of take it or leave it in some of those topics. But just to make my opinion known on a lot of those different things, I hope that Alabama at some point moves on to having a little bit of the tougher schedules for years to come. And like I said, there's a couple of different ways of looking at it. The next way of looking at it is to kind of highlight the need for a 9-game conference schedule. The SEC and the ACC are still the only two conferences of the Power 5 that don't play these 9-game conference schedules. And I think it's important to look at that, especially with the expansion that came 5 or 6 years ago, bringing in Mizzou, bringing in Texas A&M. You guys will remember that Bama went to Athens in 2015, won't make a trip back there until 2024, 2025. And so some of the things you highlight when you talk about that non-conference schedule, talk about making some of these away trips. Does Nick Saban want it? Does Nick Saban not want it? Well, our guy Paul Finebaum jumped on Jocks earlier this morning to talk about kind of what Nick Saban's up against. The fact that Nick Saban's one of these guys that loves the 9-game conference schedule, but programs like Vanderbilt and Kentucky, maybe Mississippi State, some of these other lesser programs aren't in love with the idea. Here's what Paul Finebaum had to say on Jocks this morning.
Outside of Nick Saban's office, there is none. And Jim, I don't see it, and there are a lot of reasons for it. From I think their standpoint, it will create more difficulty filling the bowl alignment. The bowl alignment is in terms of what and the number of SEC schools that go to bowl games. So I mean, when you add another game, I mean, do the math. It's another loss somewhere. And I think the feeling, at least of the coaches right now and others in the league, is they don't want that. I think it's easy to look at the other side, and frankly, I've always agreed with Nick Saban that 9 conference games offer many positive things.
Now, listen, I got to be honest with you guys. A lot of people are waiting in the comment section already. Chris McLeod says, tell me who's played the likes of FSU, Michigan, Wisconsin, USC to start the season. The easy answer is nobody. Now, you have had teams like LSU that have ventured out. You have teams like Auburn that's going to start the year with Washington. There are some few and far between. Texas A&M schedules a home and home with Clemson. Auburn's done the home and home with Clemson. So you've seen some of the home and home games mixed in. When you highlight the names of the team, though, really the power teams that Alabama's played in the last 10 years, though, nobody's even close. You've played Clemson. You've played Florida State a couple of times. You've played Virginia Tech, West Virginia, Wisconsin, USC. We've gone down the list at Alabama in terms of non-conference opponents. But I do want to point out the fact that I am in love with the idea of a 9-game conference schedule. If you're not in love with it, let me point out to you why. I went to almost every stadium in the SEC when I was a part of the football team. The only one I didn't make it to, South Carolina. They played there when I redshirted in 2005. They went back in 2010. There are people on the schedule. There are players on the roster right now that will not get to see, between the hedges in Athens. They won't get to make the trip down to the swamp down in Florida. That was a huge part of my college experience, and we're not seeing it anymore with some of these 14-team, conference alignments where, listen, you go to Athens and Georgia comes in 2020, and then you go back to Athens in 2025. I just think, honestly, it's my personal opinion. I think it's a little bit garbage. Now, a lot of these people weighing in the comment section saying most of the SEC will be in the same combo as the rest of these easy wins. I completely agree with that, but when you talk to Nick Saban, when you talk about Paul Finebaum's comments really there, I think Nick Saban's highlighting the need. Now, there are going to be people that talk about Vanderbilt, that talk about Kentucky, that talk about, whatever other team you want to talk about, maybe Missouri, they're scratching and clawing for bowl wins, for victories to get to bowl eligibility, that don't want this to happen. That's why Nick Saban's not getting much backing in terms of these non-conference schedules really moving to 9 SEC games and really knocking one of those cupcakes off the list. A lot of these SEC teams just aren't going to back that. They're trying to get to bowl eligibility, making sure they get those checks kind of locked in, making sure their team kind of moves on to the next level. So I think it's a little bit interesting to look at. Chris McLeod agrees with me. He says, I agree. 9 conference games. Brett Tears Jr. says, me too, kind of weighing in the back that. A couple of you guys weighing in the YouTube comment section. Brian Hall says, I would definitely rather see at least 2 meaningful non-conference games. I agree with that. I think you get 2 meaningful non-conference games. You can knock off the dust against the Citadel before the Iron Bowl if you want to, then move to 9 conference games and kind of get some of these things, really the dust knocked off of what that schedule has been in years past. So I appreciate you guys continuing to weigh on to that. Please continue to weigh in the comment section. And as always, share the show. Make sure we get all your friends in the conversation. Rick Noble's weighing in the Facebook comment section. Roll Tide Roll. Jeff F. Word, personally, I don't care for the cupcake games. I end up drunk and barely paying attention to it, says our guy Stephen Early in the comments section. Boy, that's all. There is something to be said about it. I go to Tuscaloosa for all the home games, showing up, be able to drink beer. They're not really worried about the opponent like some people had to when I first got to college. It is a little bit of a nice thing to be able to have. Joe DeCasey says hello in the comment section. Hello, Joe. I hope you're doing well. Appreciate you guys joining us for this incredible talking point in terms of the schedules that are going to be upcoming for Bama for the years to come. Now, it does, before we move on topics, it does bode mentioning that Bama has scheduled home and homes with Texas, home and homes with Notre Dame, and there's a bunch of other non-conference games really kind of hitting some of the schedules in years to come. I think Nick Saban's trying to be out in front of things and wants a lot of people to kind of follow suit, and that's why these talking points continue to come up. It is middle of June, after all. It's June 18th, so these are good talking points in terms of college football. Now, this next conversation we're going to have on the show, I got to be honest with you, and anybody that knows me in the comment section knows this conversation is going to be near and dear to my heart. And this comes from BamaHammer.com, and I think they did a great job of highlighting some of the reasons that Phil Steele, the preseason magazine and the rankings that shoot out, really one of those guys that picks winners from games, across the college football landscape. He relies heavily on experienced offensive line. Now, I do want to show you the rankings that Phil Steele put out, and this was also, like I mentioned, highlighted by BamaHammer.com. Here are the rankings right here, these offensive lines. Now, these are the SEC rankings. Then in parentheses, you do have the national rankings in terms of what Phil Steele thinks about the experience levels of these offensive lines. Now, this has nothing to do with talent. That's why you see, a Vanderbilt at 4 and an LSU back at 14. But he did say he relies heavily on what these offensive line units have in terms of games started, in terms of where they've been playing along the offensive line throughout their careers. I think that's very, very interesting to look at. Now, notice Florida's at number 1. A lot of people don't talk about Florida this year. I'm a little bit higher on them than a lot of people are. Bama's sitting there right there in second place. That's Jonah Williams, who started for 2 years. That's Ross Pierschbaker, who started for 3 years. That's Matt Womack, who started all year last year. That's Lester Cotton. That's a guy in Jedrick Wills who's trying to start in the rotation. That's Bama really highlighting the front part of this list. Now, what does the Bama starting lineup end up as? We don't know yet. I mean, is Alex Leatherwood in there? Is somebody else really making some, a push, really get some playing time in the offensive line? We don't know. But I do think what the interesting part of this list is, when you look at the rankings, you talk about Ole Miss sitting right there at 3. Look at the back end of the rankings, though. You got Auburn sitting there at 13 and LSU at 14. Now, I don't have to go too far to remind you guys of what we were talking about in terms of the smallest point spreads for Alabama this year. Auburn and LSU were the only teams that were in single digits throughout the season. Auburn and LSU sitting there at 13 and 14 in terms of the offensive line rankings. I think it's going to be interesting to look at in terms of how these teams kind of move forward and way throughout the thing. Now, it does bode mentioning that by the time that Alabama gets to LSU and Auburn, those offensive lines at both those schools will have played together for a while. But this is a patchwork offensive line for LSU. This is an Ed Orgeron team that's really relying on a couple of junior college transfers to come in. Badara Traore, Damian Lewis, another one of those guys that really they're hoping can get on their starting offensive line. This is an Auburn offensive line that a lot of people wonder, hey, can Auburn really get to Alabama in the SEC West? This is an Auburn offensive line that's missing really 4 starters from last year and returning Prince Tega Winobo, who was benched at times last year. They also at Auburn have a new offensive line coach this year in J.B. Grimes, so going to be interesting to see that kind of play out in terms of what the college football landscape is back in November, because let's keep this this experience ranking for the offensive lines really in the back of your mind. I think this plays a huge key in the way I outlook. Now, listen, you can say listen, if the guy's good, the guy's good. I'm telling you right now, when I started as a sophomore, the communication was something that was so foreign to me that it really took a year of starting experience to where I really got it down to where I needed to be. When do I fire off in the snap count? When does the communication become a key? It's one of those things that really having experience becomes a really big deal in terms of how Bama moves down the schedule. Now, one player on Bama's schedule that I think is going to see a ton of benefit from this is our buddy Raekwon Davis. And I think when you look at some of the things that he's been able to do on the football field the last couple of years, he's really brought the highlight on himself. But Saturday Down South, our buddies over there at that website were able to highlight Raekwon Davis and Mac Wilson. They gave the ranking for their top 10 most likely out of the SEC West to win Defensive Player of the Year. Number 1 on that list as the countdown, our buddy Raekwon Davis. And here's what Saturday Down South had to say in terms of how they feel about Raekwon Davis and how he can really approach the, kind of making some noise in the backfield. As arguably the best player on the best team in the country, I don't know if it's even that arguable at some point, Davis should be considered a legitimate candidate for SEC Defensive Player of the Year. Assuming he stays healthy and plays remotely close to his potential, it's hard to envision him not being the odds-on favorite. Now, I think that's huge to point out when you talk about Raekwon Davis and when you talk about really the length and really the havoc he was able to reach in the college football playoff against some really good offensive lines. You look at Georgia, you look at Clemson, you look at some of the teams they played down the stretch. He was an absolute noisemaker. And so I think when you stack those statements of Raekwon Davis about can he be Defensive Player of the Year, stack that up against LSU's offensive line and Auburn's offensive line. Really, the experience those guys are going to have. The first time they get hit in the mouth by a Raekwon Davis or a Mack Wilson, who shows up at number 6 on that list from Saturday Down South, I think it'll be the first time, and I think it'll be an eye-opener. I think it'll be a head-scratcher for some of those guys. And really, I'm relying on the likes of Raekwon Davis, not only him, but Isaiah Buggs, Keenan Williams, Anthony Jennings, to really make those offensive lines look even more inexperienced than they possibly do as this schedule turns to flip down the line in November. John Billingsley weighing in saying Davis is a freak. Absolutely agree with that. When you talk about his size and power combination, you don't see that very much. James Martin Bullock, I'm not even going to read that one, talking about Florida players and having trouble with the law down there in Gainesville. Stephen Early, Davis deserves the attention, but I expect a repeat performance for that sort of award. I absolutely agree. And I think that when you look at Raekwon Davis, and that's like I said, Mack Wilson was one of those guys that was mentioned as number 6 on the list. I think the sky's the limit for a lot of these guys. Now, Deron Payne and Jonathan Allen, and you keep going back for some of these defensive linemen, repeating the performance is what's going to be a big deal. I want to see Raekwon really from the start to finish in the SEC be able to do some of the same things that he's been doing throughout his career. I don't think it's going to be that big of a question mark. I think that he understands what's on the line. I think when you look at your NFL future and what he's trying to do for this defense, I think the light switch will probably come on for Raekwon Davis in a lot of different ways. Brian Canterbury weighing in says, you do an amazing job, Mike. Roll Tide. Appreciate that a lot. You also said, watch out for Terrell Lewis. I absolutely agree with that. That goes kind of along the lines of the inexperienced offensive lines that Bama's going to be facing off against. Lance White comes in the YouTube comment section. Roll Tide. What up, Mike? What up, Lance? Appreciate you joining us over here in the YouTube comment section. William Lee kind of echoing some of the sentiments I had about Raekwon Davis, saying big things expected of Davis this season. I don't think there's any question about it. And I do want to approach you guys with the question, too, because I think it bodes mentioning. I think we'll get into this a little bit later on the week as we kind of move down the Roll Tide Daily week here in the middle of June. Who do you guys think is the most important non-quarterback on the roster for Alabama? Let's take Jalen and Tua out of it. Obviously, the conversation has been about Jalen and Tua for some time, really since we've started the show over a month ago. We've been talking about Jalen and Tua. I want to move along from that conversation. You guys chime in and tell me, who is the most important non-quarterback on the roster? Is it Raekwon Davis? Is it Mack Wilson? Is it one of the new starters in the secondary, Pat Surtain, Savion Smith? Is it somebody else, Deontay Thompson, who needs to step up to the plate? Maybe a wide receiver, maybe a Jerry Jeudy, maybe a Damian Harris, who we covered a lot last week. Donald and Brittany Schultz weighing in. Damian Harris already weighing in on that. James Perkins says it's the pass rushers who are going to be the most important non-quarterbacks on the roster. Jerome Webb. Ray will be a man on the defensive line. Chris McLeod weighing in says Wilson gets my vote if he can stay healthy. Listen, the sky's the limit for Mack Wilson. The sky's the limit for Dylan Moses. I am going to pay attention to see if those guys can kind of stay healthy throughout this year. Surely, when you look at Bama football and the linebackers, the injury bug can't bite quite as hard, right? 2 years in a row at the linebacker position as it did last year. So I completely agree with our guy, Chris McLeod, on that. Brian Hall over in the YouTube comment section kind of weighing in and saying Jonah Williams. Now, that's a man after my own heart, pointing out at offensive lineman being one of the biggest players. We did highlight him last week in terms of maybe being the 4th overall selection in next year's NFL draft. So I appreciate you guys coming in with that. Early Houston saying definitely the wide receivers. Clem Kyle Summers saying Surtain. Keep the answers coming there in the comment section. I think this is going to be a topic we're going to cover throughout the week. It's one of those interesting dynamics to dive down into the position groups and really pick out some of the most important players as we move along. It's not just Jalen and Tua, right? They're not throwing the ball to themselves, although some people do wish Jalen would switch over to that wide receiver position. A lot of you guys have weighed in on that. So Ricky K. Little says we need good kickers. I completely agree with that. That's something a lot of people don't like to talk about. Now, in terms of Jalen and Tua, everybody likes to talk about it, right? Everybody likes to weigh in with their opinion, and that's how we, come to topic number 3 here towards the end of the show. One name that you don't expect to kind of put it out there, and a guy who has dealt with a ton of quarterback battles in his day, that's Bobby Bowden. Now, Bobby Bowden was at a charity golf tournament this weekend over in Birmingham. A lot of you guys know that Bobby Bowden's from, the Birmingham area, so he goes back to Alabama quite a bit. Now, he caught up with Christina from WBRC, and this was launched out on Twitter earlier this weekend. Bobby Bowden had something to say about the Jalen and Tua quarterback competition, and it's not who a lot of you guys think he's going to be rooting for. Here's what Bobby Bowden had to say this weekend about that ongoing quarterback competition between Jalen and Tua.
What a great problem. Which quarterback is going to start? What a great problem. One of them's won about 20 games, the other one's won 1. Nick can't go wrong on it. If I got a guy that won 20 ball games, I got another that coached 1, I'm going to go with that 20. I'm going to play the odds.
I think that's pretty interesting there coming out of Bobby Bowden's mouth. I wish it was all that easy, right? I do find it interesting, too, that when I was at Alabama and we lost to Florida State and Bobby Bowden, he was in the middle of a quarterback problem, right? If you guys remember back to that 2007 season, it was Drew Weatherford versus Xavier Lee. Xavier Lee starts against Alabama, has the game of his career, and nobody ever heard from Xavier Lee again. So it is interesting to kind of see that played out. Now, I will tell you, I'm from Florida. I'm from the Panhandle of Florida. Bobby Bowden is an absolute legend where I come from. So anything he has to say, I'm going to listen to it. But I don't know if I agree with his sentiment and his backing for Jalen versus Tua. I think you look at the games he's won, you look at the defenses Jalen's played with, he does deserve credit. I mean, Jalen deserves a ton of credit for everything he's done. I'm very thankful that he's part of this Alabama roster. I think he's represented Alabama in a first-class manner. But you can't just point to the record, right? You can't just say 26-2. Keep in mind, we lost a national championship game with Jalen Hurts at quarterback and almost lost a second one this past year against Georgia with Jalen Hurts at quarterback. And so Bobby Bowden is kind of, has some loaded sentiment in there when you talk about this quarterback competition and things ongoing. I appreciate Bobby Bowden weighing in. I know that he was framed with the question he probably wasn't that prepared to answer, but it is interesting to always kind of get his take in terms of what he's been able to do. Robbie Harris weighing in the comment section saying Roll Tide. Mike Avery Orange Sr. saying Jalen Hurts. Obviously his pick to win the quarterback battle. James Perkins weighing in about Bobby Bowden saying that's why he's not coaching anymore. And I think that's pretty tough, but Bobby Bowden is up there in age and kind of listening to what he has to say on the conversation. I think it's a little bit of a head scratcher. Terrence Branier kind of weighing in about Bobby Bowden says old Dag Nabbit. I think that's awesome too in terms of Bobby Bowden. The guy's a legend. I mean, you got to give him credit where credit's due. He has a couple of national championship rings down at Florida State. But listen, I think Nick Saban's going to approach it from a little bit different angle than just who's won the most games. Listen, Tua wasn't there for a lot of those games, so Tua doesn't get credit for that. Corey Weatherly weighing in saying Tua any day. Don Lavelle saying big on big Tua, big on little Jalen. That's some tougher thing. Robbie Harris weighing in saying both quarterbacks are pushing each other. Now, I do agree with that, and I think that's one of the things that gets lost in this. It's not just somebody showing up to practice saying, I'm the man, I'm the quarterback, I'm going to throw these routes and get out of here. Both these guys are probably staying after a lot of these practices in the summer, making sure they get a lot of what's going on. Out there in the practice field, the 7-on-7s, making sure they're keeping up with their wide receivers. I think they are pushing, a lot of big ways to make sure this battle's kind of pushing on. Appreciate you guys weighing in the comment section. It's been a great day in the comment section. I continue to weigh in on that. And please, if you guys will, share the show. Roll Tide Daily. We're on every day at 1 o'clock Eastern time. I'm your host, Mike Johnson. Actually played at Alabama from 2005 to 2009. Have a national championship ring of my own, captain, whatever else you want to say in terms of that. So keep weighing in on the conversation. Let's keep that going. Roll Tide Daily, and hope all you guys get a chance to share the show with your friends. Now, before I leave you guys, every day I like to put a video on here, and I think this is a pretty important video. Now, we've talked a bunch on here about Bama trying to really change the outlook on the program. Nick Saban talked about it last week. A lot of, the recruiters from other schools say, hey, we're not having any fun. They're not having any fun over there at Alabama. Listen, the fun is in the winning. Nick Saban used to say it all the time. But there has been an effort on Bama's part, especially on social media, to make sure the word's getting out. This goes back to the boat day at the Saban house where the boat breaks down. This goes back to coaches saying, listen, we're having a ton of fun doing this, ton of fun doing that. Alabama football's official Twitter account this past week put out a pretty incredible video that I want you guys to see. If you're a Josh Jacobs fan, if you like him at the running back position, if you're a paintball fan, or if you're just an Alabama football fan, take a look at what Josh Jacobs and some of the other Alabama players were doing this past week. Looks to me like they were having a pretty good time. Here's the video right here.
Josh Jacobs here, Alabama running back. I brought all the freshmen out to paintball, rolling with the tide, you know what I'm saying? Great times. More things to come soon.
I smack all of them! This is the flag on here! You feel me? Come on, Kurt. Yes, sir! Get out of here! This is how we get down when you roll with the tide, man. This is how we do it.
Well, how incredible is that video right there? You see the production value, right? This isn't just a cell phone video from Nick Saban's boat. They got drone footage. They've got all this different stuff kind of coming in there, making sure it's a good production. Say, hey, listen, all that negative recruiting that you're hearing out of some of the other schools in the SEC, we're going to fight that. We're going to talk about how much fun we're having. That actually got retweeted by Michael Loxley and a couple of the other Alabama coaches saying, listen, we're having a lot of fun over here. David Ferris weighing in saying, love it. Paintball is a blast and great for team building. I absolutely agree with that. I think anytime you talk about going paintball and really anything to do with the team, this is something a lot of my friends used to do back in the day. It just didn't get talked about much because you didn't have to worry about negative recruiting saying Bama players didn't have fun. Now, all of a sudden, that becomes a big part of the deal as we move forward. So thank you guys all for weighing in the comment section today. We're going to be back at it tomorrow, just like every Monday through Thursday, 1 o'clock Eastern time, noon Central. If you're in Alabama, if you're in Georgia, if you're in Florida, if you're in anywhere, really, share the show with your friends. Make sure you're hanging out with us. If you do enjoy SEC Country Live, I will be back on this air at 3 o'clock Eastern time, hanging out with Brandon Adams from Dog Nation Daily. We're going to be talking about all the news from around the SEC. Hope you guys will be able to join us for that and join in the fun comment section. But until then, hope you guys have a great rest of your Monday. I'll see you guys tomorrow, and roll Tide.
You've been watching Roll Tide Daily, the new daily program for Crimson Tide fans, presented by SEC Country.